Okay, the last recording cut off when I loaded the Windows Phone emulator, so I'm going to start again with this recording, pick up where I left off. The last recording was 14A, this one will be 14B. So, what we're looking at here is a bit of HTML that's used in Cordova. So, we talked about Android and how that has an XML-based layout and then Java classes behind the scenes that operate on button clicks and things like that. So, on the other hand, Cordova, which we're looking here at Cordova within the Windows Phone app, is HTML and JavaScript all bundled together. So if you've used HTML before, Cordova is an easy thing to jump into. And I'll say it's especially easy on Windows Phone because setting up Visual Studio to use Cordova is quite simple. You just need Visual Studio, and then you need the Cordova zip. You deploy the zip in a specific folder, and then everything else pretty much just comes together. So this is the presentation. If I bring the emulator over here, I can click on search by color and it's going to render this screen. And so we see we have a few buttons up here. One thing I really like about Cordova on Windows is this. It's either from Photo Library or from Photo Album, but it brings up a really nice view of sample photos, very easy to select a photo. And then when we come back to the screen, we see we have our four buttons up here and then the photo down below. So Windows plus Cordova is a very nice integration there where you can flip through and see the camera roll or the photo view, very nice. So we see we have some buttons here and then an image below, and even accessing the photo library was quite easy. So these are all things that are done with HTML and JavaScript. So this is the screen we were just looking at. We see that what it's going to do is when we select an image, there's a bit of JavaScript here that tells it to display on the screen. And then down below we have some functions. These are things that operate when we click one of those buttons. So here in Cordova, both the presentation, like the presentation of these buttons and the presentation of the images below it, both the presentation and the logic or the code that executes is all in one page. Okay, whereas with Android, we saw the presentation was one XML page, and then the code that happens when you click on a button was in another file. So two different theories here. One is to put it all in one, the other is to separate it. It might sound easier to put it all in one, but from a purity standpoint, it's really better to keep them separate, a little bit better for reuse. So that's two different ways that we can do presentation. Another option is to just use straight code. The first mobile development class that I taught was BlackBerry, and with that, it had everything in code. So there wasn't a different presentation view versus the user interface logic. You basically had to program the user interface. You had to program exactly where the buttons go. It was kind of a clunky way to do it, to be honest with you. Now, that was several versions ago, so I'm sure the current version is different. Well, I don't have experience with it myself. I'm sure the current version is just different. So the presentation logic, oftentimes XML or HTML, that's what the user looks at. And then underneath that is the user interface logic that does things like decide what to do when the user clicks a button, what logic to happen then, and decides how to populate autocomplete lists. The layer immediately underneath that will usually be the business logic layer, and then the layer underneath that will be a data or persistence layer. So we'll actually have several different layers. I'll bring up Plant Places Mobile. Might just take a moment. I have a lot of things running right now, so it might just take a moment. I'll bring up Plant Places Mobile again, and I'll show you a little bit about how we use each of these layers in Plant Places Mobile. So in programming, we oftentimes have this concept of packages, or in other words, folders where we can store things. So here on Plant Places Mobile, if you see there's this package or folder called com.plantplaces, this is where all of the user interface logic goes. Okay? Now in Android, it's typical to put the presentation layer in a folder called res, and then a subfolder called layouts. So the presentation, the XML files, in other words, go under this res layout as we see here. So res layout, that's where the XML goes. But the user interface logic goes under com.plantplaces. Now the business logic I've put in this thing called com.plantplaces.service. And there are some what is business logic? It's the rules that execute. It's the way that we execute certain rules. It's how we decide. Business logic is honestly hard to describe. It's easier to show an example. One example is this. We should make it very easy to go online or offline and make that seamless to the user. So we don't want the user to click a button that says I am online and then the user click another button that says I am offline. We want to do that seamlessly. Okay? So because we can, while using a phone, it might go online, offline several times during the use of one application. So we don't want to bother the user with that. We want to handle it behind the scenes. That's something that we can handle in the business logic layer. So if you see here, when the user searches on something, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to try to go online to get the most up-to-date data. If that fails, though, it comes down here and it looks at the data which is already on the phone, and it attempts to go ahead and proceed with the user experience using local data. So, option one, try to use network data. If that fails, use local data instead. But don't bother the user by telling the user, hey, I'm going offline. Just go ahead and show what you can. That's something that would happen in a business logic layer. Another big thing in the business logic layer is where we're turning data into information. So here's another thing that happens in the business logic layer. This is the logic where it chooses the top 12 colors. So on the color match search where it matches a plant by color, this is the business logic where it is finding what the top 12 colors are. So what's the data? The data are the color that the user selected and the plants that and the colors of plants on the plantplaces.com database. Now, what's the information? The information is matching the color that the user selected with plants that have that color. So taking the entire set of data and finding only the data that the user wants to see, that's providing information. Or allowing the user to choose a color and then showing plants that have that color, that's information. So that's the kind of thing that we do in a business logic layer. Choose the top 12 colors, then when the user chooses a color, find plants that match that color. So it's one layer below the UI, because the UI would actually be showing the color, but you see this is actually doing the math on which colors we want to send to the UI. And it's a layer above data access, because the data access layer is going to allow us to send in one color and it's going to say respond back with a list of plants that match that color. So color match is a business logic component.